History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3, The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 7, Jewry and the Coming of Christianity. The Jewishness of Christianity is fundamental and probably its salvation, to speak in worldly terms. For the odds against the historical survival, let alone worldwide success of a small sect centered upon a holy man in the Roman Eastern Empire were enormous. Judaism was a matrix and protecting environment for a long time as well as the source of the most fundamental Christian ideas. In return, Jewish ideas and myths were to be generalized through Christianity to become world forces. At the heart of these was the Jewish view that history was a meaningful story, providentially ordained, a cosmic drama of the unfolding design of the one omnipotent God for his chosen people. Through his covenant with that people could be found guidance for the right action, and it lay in adherence to his law. The breaking of that law had always brought punishment, such as had come to the whole people in the desert of Sinai and by the waters of Babylon. In obedience to it lay the promise of salvation for the community. This great drama was the inspiration of Jewish historical writings, in which the Jews of the Roman Empire discerned the pattern which made their lives meaningful. That mythological pattern was deeply rooted in Jewish historical experience, which, after the great days of Solomon, had been bitter, fostering an enduring distrust of the foreigner and an iron will to survive. Few things are more remarkable in the life of this remarkable people than the simple fact of its continued existence. The exile, which began in 587 BC, when Babylonian conquerors took many of the Jews away after the destruction of the temple, was the last crucial experience in the molding of their national identity before modern times. It finally crystallized the Jewish vision of history. The exiles heard prophets like Ezekiel promise a renewed covenant. Judah had been punished for its sins by exile and the temple's destruction. Now, God would turn his face again to Judah, who would return again to Jerusalem, delivered out of Babylon as Israel had been delivered out of Ur, out of Egypt. The temple would be rebuilt. Perhaps only a minority of the Jews of the exile heeded this, but it was a significant one, and it included Judah's religious and administrative elite. If we are to judge by the quality of those, again, probably a minority, who, when they could do so, returned to Jerusalem a saving remnant according to prophecy. Before that happened, the experience of the exile had transformed Jewish life as well as confirming the Jewish vision. Scholars are divided as to whether the more important developments took place among the exiles or among the Jews who were left in Judah to lament what had happened. In one way or another, though Jewish religious life was deeply stirred. The most important change was the implanting of the reading of the scriptures as the central act of Jewish religion. While the Old Testament was not to assume its final form for another 3 or 4 centuries, the first 5 books, or Pentateuch, traditionally ascribed to Moses, were substantially complete soon after the return from the exile. Without the focus of cult practice at the temple, the Jews seem to have turned to weekly meetings to hear these sacred texts read and expounded. They contained the promise of a future and guidance to its achievement through maintenance of the law, now given a new detail and coherence. This was one of the slow effects of the work of the interpreters and scribes who had to reconcile and explain the sacred books. In the end, there was to grow out of these weekly meetings both the institution of synagogue and a new liberation of religion from locality and ritual. However, much and long Jews continued to pine for the restoration of the temple. The Jewish religion could eventually be practiced wherever Jews could come together to read the scriptures. They were to be the first peoples of a book, and Christians and Muslims were to follow them. It made possible greater abstraction and universalizing of the vision of God. There was a narrowing too. Although Jewish religion might be separated from the temple cult, some prophets had seen the redemption and purification which must lie ahead, as only to be approached through an even more rigid enforcement of what was now believed to be Mosaic law. Ezra brought back its precepts from Babylon, and observances which had been in origin those of nomads were now imposed rigorously on an increasingly urbanized people. The self segregation of Jews became much more important and obvious in towns. It was seen as a part of the purification which was needed that every Jew married to a Gentile wife, and there must have been many, should divorce her. This was after the Persian overthrow of Babylon. In 539 BC, some of the Jews took the opportunity offered to them and came back to Jerusalem. The temple was rebuilt during the next 25 years, and Judah became under Persian overlordship, a sort of theocratic satrapy. In the 5th century, when Egypt revolted against Persian rule, this was a strategically sensitive area, and it was governed lightly and with the help of the native priestly aristocracy. This provided the political articulation of Jewish nationhood until Roman times. With the ending of Persian rules, the age of Alexander's heirs brought new problems. After being ruled by the Ptolemies, the Jews eventually passed to the Seleucids. The social behavior and thinking of the upper classes underwent the influence of Hellenization. This sharpened the divisions by exaggerating contrasts of wealth and differences between townsmen and countrymen. It also separated the priestly families from the people, who remained firmly in the tradition of law and the prophets, as expounded in the synagogues. The Great Maccabean Revolt broke out 168 to 164 BC against the Seleucid king of Hellenistic Syria, Antiochus IV, and cultural westernization approved by the priests but resented by the masses. Antiochus had tried to go too fast, not content with steady erosion of Jewish insularity by Hellenistic civilization and the friction of example. He had interfered with Jewish rites and profaned the temple by seeking to turn it into the temple of Olympian Zeus. Perhaps, though, he only wished to open the temple complex to all worshippers, as was normal for any temple in a Hellenistic society. After the revolt had been repressed with difficulty and guerrilla war went on long after, a more conciliatory policy was resumed by the Seleucid kings. It did not satisfy many Jews who, in 142 BC, were able to take advantage of a favorable set of circumstances to win an independence which was to last for nearly 80 years. Then, in 63 BC, Pompey imposed Roman rule, and there disappeared the last independent Jewish state in the Near East for nearly 2000 years. Independence had not been a happy experience. A succession of kings drawn from the priestly families had thrown the country into disorder by innovation and high handedness. They and the priests who had acquiesced in their policies excited opposition. They were challenged in their authority by a new, more austere school of interpreters who clung to the law rather than the cult as the heart of Judaism and gave it new and searchingly rigorous interpretation. These were the Pharisees, the representatives of a reforming strain which was time and time again to express itself in Jewry in protest against the danger of creeping Hellenization. They also accepted proselytism among non Jews, teaching a belief in the resurrection of the dead and a divine last judgment. There was a mixture in their stance of national and universal aspiration, and they drew out further the implications of Jewish monotheism. Most of these changes took place in Judea, the tiny rump of the once great kingdom of David. Fewer Jews lived there in the time of Augustus than in the rest of the empire. From the 7th century onwards, they had spread over the civilized world. The armies of Egypt, Alexander, and the Seleucids all had Jewish regiments. Others had settled abroad in the course of trade. One of the greatest Jewish colonies was at Alexandria, where they had gathered from about 300 BC. The Alexandrian Jews were Greek speaking. There, the Old Testament was first translated into Greek, and when Jesus was born, there were probably more Jews there than in Jerusalem. In Rome, there were another 50,000 or so. Such agglomerations increased the opportunities to proselytize and therefore the danger of friction between communities. Jewry offered much to the world where traditional cults had waned. Circumcision and dietary restraints were obstacles, but were far outweighed for many a proselyte by the attractions of a code of behavior of great minuteness, a form of religion not dependent on temples, shrines, or priesthood for its exercise, and above all, the assurance of salvation. A prophet whose teaching was ascribed by the Old Testament compilers to Isaiah, but who is almost certainly of the exile, had already announced a message to bring light to the Gentiles, and many of them had responded to that light long before the Christians, who were to promote it in a new sense. The proselytes could identify themselves with the chosen people in the great story which inspired Jewish historical writings, the only achievement in this field worthy of comparison with the Greek invention of scientific history, and one which gave meaning to the tragedies of the world. In their history, the Jews discerned an unfolding pattern by which they were being refined in the fire for the day of judgment. A fundamental contribution of Jewry to Christianity would be its sense of the people apart, its eyes set on things not of this world. Christians were to go on to the idea of the heaven in the lump, working to redeem the world. Both myths were deeply rooted in Jewish historical experience and in the remarkable, though simple fact of this people's survival at all. The big communities of Jews and Jewish proselytes were important social facts to Roman governors, standing out not only because of their size but because of their tenacious separateness. Archaeological evidence of synagogues as special and separate buildings does not appear until well into the Christian era, but Jewish quarters in cities were distinct, clustering about their own synagogues and courts of law. While proselytizing was widespread and even some Romans were attracted by Jewish belief, there were also early signs of popular dislike of Jews in Rome itself. Rioting was frequent in Alexandria and easily spread to other towns of the Near East. This led to distrust on the part of authorities and, at least at Rome, to the dispersal of Jewish communities when things became difficult. Judea itself was regarded as a particular ticklish and dangerous area to this, the religious ferment of the last century and a half BC had greatly contributed. In 37 BC, the Senate appointed a Jew, Herod, the great king of Judea. He was an unpopular monarch. No doubt there was popular distaste for a Roman nominee and a ruler anxious with reason to preserve the friendship of Rome. Herod earned further dislike, though, by the Hellenistic style of life at his court, though he was careful to display his loyalty to the Jewish religion, and by the heavy taxes which he raised, some of them for grandiose building. Even if it were not for the legendary massacre of the innocents and his place in Christian demonology, Herod would not have had a good historical press. At his death in 4 BC, His kingdom was divided between his three sons, an unsatisfactory arrangement which was superseded in 6 AD, when Judea became part of the Roman province of Syria, governed from Caesarea. In 26 AD, Pontius Pilate became procurator, the taxing officer or effectively governor, the uncomfortable and exacting post he was to hold for 10 years. It was a bad moment in the history of a turbulent province. Something of a climax to the excitements of nearly 2 centuries was being reached. The Jews were at loggerheads with their Samaritan neighbors and resented an influx of Greek Syrians noticeable in the coastal towns. They detested Rome as the latest of a long line of conquerors and also because of its demands for taxes. Tax gatherers, the Republicans of the New Testament, were unpopular not just because of what they took, but because they took it for the foreigner. But worse still, the Jews were also bitterly divided among themselves. The great religious festivals were often stained by bloodshed and rioting. Pharisees, for instance, were deeply antagonistic to Sadducees, the formalizing representatives of the aristocratic priestly caste. Other sects rejected them both. One of the most interesting has become known to us only in the recent years through the discovery and reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in which it can be seen to have promised its adherents much that was also offered by early Christianity. It looked forward to a last deliverance which would follow Judea's apostasy and would be announced by the coming of a Messiah. Jews attracted by such teaching searched the writings of the prophets for the prefigurings of these things. Others sought a more direct way. The Zealots looked to the nationalist resistance movement as the way ahead. Into this electric atmosphere, Jesus was born in about 6 BC into a world in which thousands of his countrymen awaited the coming of a Messiah, a leader who would lead them to military or symbolic victory and inaugurate the last and the greatest days of Jerusalem. The evidence for the facts of his life is contained in the records written down after his death in the Gospels, the assertions and traditions which the early church based on the testimony of those who had actually known Jesus. The Gospels are not by themselves satisfactory evidence, but their inadequacies can be exaggerated. They were no doubt written to demonstrate the supernatural authority of Jesus and the confirmation provided by the events of his life for the prophecies which had long announced the coming of a Messiah. This interested and hagiographical origin does not demand skepticism about the facts asserted. Many have inherent plausibility in that they are what might be expected of a Jewish religious leader of the period. They need not be rejected. Much more inadequate evidence about far more intractable subjects has often to be employed. There is no reason to be more austere or rigorous in our canons of acceptability for early Christian records than for, say, the evidence in Homer which illuminates Mycenae. Nevertheless, it was very hard to find corroborative evidence of the facts stated in the Gospels in other records. The picture of Jesus presented in them is of a man of modest, though not destitute family, with a claim to royal lineage. Such a claim would no doubt have been denied by his opponents if there had not been something in it. Galilee, where Jesus grew up, was something of a frontier area for Judaism, where it was most exposed to the contact with Syrian Greeks, which often irritated religious sensibilities. There preached in the neighborhood a man called John, a prophet to whom crowds had flocked in the days before his arrest and execution. Scholars have tried to link John with the Qumran community, which left behind the Dead Sea Scrolls. He appears, though, to have been a solitary, highly individual figure, a teacher modeling himself on the prophets. One evangelist tells us that he was the cousin of Jesus. This is possibly true, but less important than the agreement of all the Gospels that John baptized Jesus as he baptized countless others who came to him fearing the approach of the last day. He is also said to have recognized in Jesus a teacher like himself and perhaps something more. Art thou he that cometh, or look we for another? Jesus knew himself to be a holy man. His teaching and the evidence of his sanctity, which was seen in miracles, soon convinced the excited multitude of Jerusalem. His triumphal entry to the city was based on their spontaneous feeling. They followed him as they followed other great teachers in the hope of the Messiah that was to come. The end came with the charge of blasphemy through a Jewish court and the relaxation of the letter of Roman law by Pilate in order to avoid further trouble in the violent city. Jesus was not a Roman citizen, and for such men, the extreme penalty was crucifixion after scourging. The inscription on the cross on which he was nailed said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This was a Roman governor's political irony, and that the significance of it should not go unnoted was ensured by posting the words in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. This was probably in 33 AD, though 29 AD and 30 AD have also been put forward as dates. Shortly after his death, Jesus' disciples believed that he had risen from the dead, that they had seen him and his ascension into heaven, and that they had received a divine gift of power from him at Pentecost, which would sustain them and their adherents until the last day. That would soon come, they also believed, and would bring back Jesus as the judge sitting at the right hand of God. All this the Gospels tells us. If this was what the first Christians saw in Christ, as he came to be called from the Greek word meaning the anointed one, there were also in his teachings other elements capable of far wider application. The reported devotional ideas of Jesus do not go beyond custom. Jewish service in the temple and observance of traditional holy days and feasts, together with the private prayer, were that he indicated. In this very real sense, he lived and died a Jew. His moral teaching, though, focused upon repentance and deliverance from sin, and upon a deliverance available to all, and not just the Jews. Retribution had its part in Jesus' teaching. On this, the Pharisees agreed with him. Strikingly, most of the more terrifying things said in the New Testament are attributed to him. Fulfillment of the law was essential, yet it was not enough. Beyond observance lay the duties of repentance and restitution in the case of wrong done, even of self sacrifice. The law of love was the proper guide to action. Emphatically, Jesus rejected the role of the political leader. A political quietism was one of the meanings later discerned in a dictum which was to prove to be of terrible ambiguity. My kingdom is not of this world. Yet a Messiah who would be a political leader was expected by many. Others sought a leader against the Jewish religious establishment and therefore were potentially a danger to order, even if they aimed only at religious purification and reform. Inevitably, Jesus of the house of David became a dangerous man in the eyes of the authorities. One of his disciples was Simon the Zealot, an alarming associate because he had been a member of an extremist sect. Many of Jesus' teachings encouraged feeling against the dominant Sadducees and Pharisees, and they, in their turn, strove to draw out any anti Roman implication which could be discerned in what he said. Such facts provide the background to Jesus' destruction and the disappointment of the people. They do not explain the survival of his teachings. He had appealed not only to the politically dissatisfied but to Jews who felt that the law was no longer guide enough, and to non Jews who, though they might win second class citizenship of Israel as proselytes, wanted something more to assure them of acceptance at the day of judgment. Jesus had also attracted the poor and outcast. They were many in a society which offered enormous contrasts of wealth and no mercy to those who fell by the wayside. These were some of the appeals and ideas which were to yield in the end an astonishing harvest. Yet, though they were effective in his own time, they seemed to die with him. At his death, his followers were only one tiny Jewish sect among many. But they believed that a unique thing had happened. They believed that Christ had risen from the dead, that they had seen him, and that he offered to them and those that were saved by his baptism the same overcoming of death and personal life after God's judgment. The generalization of this message was, and its presentation to the civilized world, achieved within a half century of Jesus' death. The conviction of the disciples led them to remain at Jerusalem, an important center of pilgrimage for the Jews from all over the Near East, and therefore a seminal center for a new doctrine. Two of Jesus' disciples, Peter and Jesus' brother James, were the leaders of a tiny group which awaited the imminent return of the Messiah, striving to prepare for it by penitence and the service of God in the temple. They stood emphatically within the Jewish fold. Only the rite of baptism probably distinguished them. Yet other Jews saw in them a danger their contacts with Greek speaking Jews from outside Judea led to questioning of the authority of the priests. The first martyr, Stephen, one of this group, was lynched by a Jewish crowd. One of those who witnessed this was a Pharisee from Tarsus of the tribe of Benjamin, named Paul. It may have been that as a Hellenized Jew of the dispersion, he was specially conscious of the need for orthodoxy. He was proud of his own. Yet he is the greatest influence in the making of Christianity after Jesus himself. Somehow, Paul underwent a change of heart. From being a persecutor of the followers of Jesus Christ, he became one himself. It seems to have followed a sojourn of meditation and reflection in the deserts of the East Palestine. Then, in 47 AD, or perhaps earlier, dating Paul's life and travels is a very uncertain business. He began a series of missionary journeys which took him all over the eastern Mediterranean. In 49 AD, an apostolic council at Jerusalem took the momentous decision to send him as a missionary to Gentiles, who would not be required to undergo the circumcision, which was the most important act of submission to the Jewish faith. It is not clear whether he, the council, or both in agreement were responsible. There were already little communities of Jews following the new teaching in Asia Minor, where it had been carried by pilgrimage. Now, these were given a great consolidation by Paul's efforts. His special targets were Jewish proselytes, Gentiles to whom he could preach in Greek and who were now offered full membership of Israel through the new covenant. The doctrine that Paul taught was new. He rejected the law as Jesus had never done and strove to reconcile the essentially Jewish ideas at the heart of Jesus' teachings with the conceptual world of the Greek language. He continued to emphasize the imminence of the coming end of things, but offered all nations through Christ the chance of understanding the mysteries of creation and, above all, of the relationship of things seen and things invisible, of the spirit and the flesh, and of the overcoming of the second by the first. In the process, Jesus became more than a human deliverer who had overcome death and was God Himself, and this was to shatter the mold of Jewish thought within which the faith had been born. There was no lasting place for such an idea within Jewry, and Christianity was now forced out of the temple. The intellectual world of Greece was the first of many new resting places it was to find as the centuries went by. A colossal theoretical structure was to be built on this change. The Acts of the Apostles give plentiful evidence of the uproar which such teachings could cause, and also of the intellectual tolerance of the Roman administration when public order was not involved. But it often was. In 59 AD, Paul had to be rescued from the Jews at Jerusalem by the Romans. When put on trial in the following year, he appealed to the emperor and to Rome. He went, apparently with success. From that time, he is lost to history. He may have perished in a persecution by Nero in 67 AD.